Welcome back, everyone. Glad to have you with us again. Today, we're going deep on something, well, pretty profound, I guess you could say. We're going to be talking about psychedelics and spirituality.
Yeah.
And no, we're not, talking about just like, casual use or anything like that. This is really about, thinking about substances like psilocybin, LSD, even ayahuasca as like tools for spiritual exploration.
Yeah, it's interesting you say tools because I think that really gets at the question here, right? It's not so much about the substances themselves, but like how they're used, what they might help us unlock. And it's fascinating because, for centuries, right, certain traditions have viewed these substances as like almost sacred,
Right.
like keys to these higher states of consciousness. But in our modern world, those keys come with a whole new set of considerations.
Yeah. And reading through the material for this episode, people describe these really profound experiences, right? Like this interconnectedness, this ego dissolution, almost like tapping into some kind of universal consciousness,
Yeah.
which is a far cry from just, seeing some pretty colors.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? This is about fundamentally like shifting your perception of reality. So I can see why people connect it to this idea of spiritual awakening.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because you think about practices like meditation or deep prayer, certain forms of yoga, they're all aiming for that same thing, the ego dissolution, this experience of oneness.
Right.
And that's where it gets really kind of, I think, it gets at the heart of the debate. Is this like a shortcut to what, mystics have been striving for millennia through really rigorous practice? Or is there something fundamentally different going on?
Yeah, and and thinking about this idea, one of the sources used this, I thought, really compelling analogy, this idea of the ego as like a filter, right? Like it obscures our perception of this larger reality. And it suggests that, psychedelics, especially in higher doses, they might temporarily lift that filter. It really makes you question how much of, what we perceive is really just shaped by our own limited view.
Absolutely, yeah. And, it makes me think about this whole idea of integration, right? Because you can imagine, like, having some profound spiritual insight on a retreat or something.
Right.
But then you come back to the daily grind and you lose it, and it feels like maybe it's a similar thing with some of these experiences. It's not just like a one and done kind of thing.
So it's not like a spiritual shortcut.
Right.
You're not bypassing the work.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, think of it more like a catalyst, maybe. They can shake things up, they can offer these glimpses.
Right.
But, like, integrating that into your everyday life,
Right.
that takes, well, real work, reflection, probably some guidance, I think, is really helpful for people.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And it makes sense, right? It's like any profound experience you have, you really have to kind of process it and weave it into, who you are. But, it's interesting because the sources also talk about, the therapeutic potential.
Yep.
It's not all just like mystical insights and things like that.
Yeah.
There's research on using these substances to help people heal from trauma, to navigate grief, even to break free from like addictive patterns.
Yeah, and that's what I think makes this whole conversation even more interesting, right? Because if you think about spirituality as this journey of wholeness,
Okay.
of like integrating all parts of yourself, right?
Yeah.
Then dealing with those deeper wounds, those are really essential.
Okay.
Because trauma, grief, these things can be real blocks to experiencing that connection.
Oh, interesting.
So if you address the trauma and the grief, you're not just healing yourself, you're also clearing the way for that deeper, insight, I guess you could say.
Oh, that's so interesting how those pieces kind of connect there. But I mean, let's be real, the sources aren't shying away from the risks involved either. It's not all, blissful and amazing insights.
Right.
There's a lot of talk about challenging experiences, anxiety, even the need to do these things in controlled environments.
Right. And I think thankfully so. I mean, these are powerful things we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And like anything powerful, they require a certain level of, skill, responsibility, I would say. I think it's kind of, I don't know, maybe even irresponsible to pretend that there aren't risks involved.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing that the source kept mentioning was this idea of set and setting.
Right.
Can you kind of unpack that for us a little bit?
Totally. Yeah. So when they talk about set, they're really talking about your mindset, your intentions going into it. Like, what are you hoping to get out of this? What's your emotional state? Any expectations you're bringing to the table? And then setting is more about the environment,
Okay.
And that's both physical and social. Like,
Right.
Are you in a safe and comfortable space? Do you have support if things get really intense? All of these things can have a huge impact.
So it sounds like, preparation, A sense of reverence even is kind of key here. This isn't something to be taken lightly.
Exactly. And that's one of those places where the modern conversation is so different from the way these substances have been used traditionally. For centuries, a lot of indigenous cultures have incorporated these substances into their spiritual practices.
Right.
But there's this deep, deep respect.
Right. Yeah, the source talks about ayahuasca ceremonies.
Right.
Led by, like a shaman.
Right.
Where there's this whole lineage of wisdom and understanding the power and the potential dangers. It's not just recreational, it's very much a spiritual practice, often focused on healing and, connecting to something bigger.
And you just hit on something really important. It's that distinction.
It really highlights the difference between approaching these substances with like reverence versus recklessness. And it feels like, even if our modern context is different, we can't ignore the wisdom of those traditions. And that there's so much to learn from how they approach it with the preparation and the intention, the integration afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think the lesson is that we need to perfectly replicate these ancient ceremonies.
Right.
But it's understanding the why behind it.
Right.
How can we approach this in a way that has that same level of respect and understanding that these are, powerful things. They're not just, party favors.
Totally. It's like, how do we bridge that ancient wisdom with our modern understanding? Because it feels like this desire to explore consciousness, to connect with something bigger than ourselves that's very human.
Yeah.
And if these substances can be, a catalyst for that, even if it's not the whole journey, it feels like something worth, exploring responsibly.
Well, and that's the big question, isn't it? And it goes back to that, that word integration.
Right.
How do we take those experiences? And I think this is true of any spiritual practice, right?
Yeah.
Whether it involves these substances or not, it's like, how does it actually translate into your life? Are you becoming more compassionate, more understanding, more present, more connected?
It's like embodying it, not just having the experience in isolation.
Exactly. It's about how you live your life, It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I feel like we're left with more questions than answers. But I think maybe that's the point.
Yeah.
It's about sparking that curiosity and that desire to learn more and to approach this topic with, caution, but also an open mind.
And honestly, sometimes those open-ended questions, those are the ones that lead to the best insights. So keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and most importantly, see how this changes how you move through the world.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone.